Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I am Clara Davison. I'm an engagement officer in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I will serve as your moderator today. So thank you so much for joining us for book club. Today we will discuss Moby-Dick by Herman Melville. This book was selected because it was one of the most recommended titles by more than 100 Department of English alumni who shared their top 10 book lists earlier this year. So a huge thank you to our College of Arts and Sciences faculty, Dr. Robert Hughes, Associate Professor in the Department of English, and Dr. Elizabeth Renker, Professor in the Department of English, for sharing their expertise with us today. So we are recording this webinar and we will share the video in a follow-up email. Attendees know that you are muted and your video is off. If you have a comment or question to add to the conversation, please use the Q&A feature you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We already have about 50 folks on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment and question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. So to get us started, Elizabeth and Robert will share some opening remarks about Moby-Dick, including responses to some of the questions that you submitted during registration. After their remarks, we will open up the conversation. So we'll get started with Elizabeth. Take it away. Over to you.
Hey everybody, yep. I want to thank everyone for coming out on this snowy afternoon to talk about Moby-Dick. And this is actually a great time for us to be getting a chance to have this conversation for a couple reasons. One, for those of you who have read Moby-Dick, and I realize some of you perhaps have, some of you have not, and some of you have probably tried and given up, and I will talk about that in my opening remarks. But you will remember that the Pequod sets sail on Christmas Day. So here we are in late December. And another great connection to think about today, since we're meditating on Moby-Dick as a novel of towering global stature, which was not always the case, incidentally, and I'll talk about that too. But it's important to remember that Melville published Moby-Dick in 1851, but the book didn't do that well in the marketplace. He had been a best-selling author, a blockbuster best-selling author as a very young man when he came home from being at sea, and his early books were huge hits in the marketplace. That was not true of Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick marked a change for him in terms of how he envisioned his own writing, what it was about, what he thought was important about it. It was a big change for him. And so the fact that the book marked a downturn in his popularity was very disappointing to him. And one of the reasons I mention that is because this was a shift in his career after Moby-Dick. And when he died in 1891, he had become an obscure figure. So he went from being a young man and transatlantic famous author in 1846 to dying in obscurity in 1891. And Moby-Dick, except for a small, devoted, essentially cult following, Moby-Dick pretty much vanished from view. And it's important to remember that Melville did not always have the stature he has now, nor did Moby-Dick. It was not always the great American novel, as someone asked about in the questions that the audience submitted. So how did that change? It's an important question. And the answer to a lot of questions like this is an historical answer. And that's the case here. So coming back to why I said this is a fortuitous moment for us to be having this conversation, 2021 marks the centennial of what Melville scholars call the Melville Revival. So the Melville Revival is a very important turn in American culture when a group of thinkers, they weren't all scholars, they weren't all professors, some of them were, a group of people from many walks of life started rereading Herman Melville. So, really what kicked off that process was a centennial observance of Melville's birth in 1819. Okay, our culture loves centennials and anniversaries, and a lot of times when these pop up, you'll get a news article. Oh, this person was born 100 years ago, that kind of a thing. So there was a little bit of centennial energy about this best-selling author, Herman Melville. It's like on the radio, whatever happened to this band, kind of a thing. And in 1921, a book was published by a man named Raymond Weaver called Herman Melville, Mariner and Mystic. And you can hear in that title two important things that will come up today: Herman Melville, Mariner and Mystic. And this book, when scholars write about the Melville revival, they often talk about this as the inaugural book that marked this energy of reclamation, in which there is this huge excitement and energy, people saying, my God, this author has been lost, and look at how amazing he is. And this energy was when Moby-Dick was first claimed to be the great American novel, with those kinds of huge claims for the importance of Moby-Dick. So anyway, important time for us to be meeting and talking about Melville. A couple of other things I thought I would mention as a way of getting our conversation started would be to say that since the Melville revival began, Melville's star has never waned. Sometimes authors come and go. Melville, his influence has towered across the 20th century, right down to today. Some of the major journals, for example, in my field of 19th century American literature, still say they get more submissions of stuff about Herman Melville than any other topic. So massive influence on how academics think about American literature, on ideas about the American canon. But let's not forget, this is not restricted to the academy. I mean, Melville's influence on the arts, and not only the literary arts, on the arts, and not only in the United States, but globally, is really incalculable. And another place where the influence shows up, and this is going to take me to my other major topic for these remarks, which is the problem of reading Moby-Dick, of actually reading it, which is that Moby-Dick in particular, among Melville's works, probably seconded, I would say, by Bartleby the Scrivener, it has a massive presence in pop culture. Now, I realized some years ago as a teacher that I was going to start teaching an entire undergraduate class on Moby-Dick alone. We read only Moby-Dick the entire semester. And the class works great. It works great from my vantage as a teacher. Students tell me how much they value the experience. And there are a lot of reasons I decided to teach it that way, mostly because I find that I meet a lot of people, not only students, but in my everyday life, once they find out that I am a Melville scholar, I get a lot of, strangely, I get a lot of apologies from people who say, either I never read Moby-Dick, in which case I say that it's fine. There's no, you don't have to read anything, really. It's, but the second kind of apology I most frequently get is and people say this with a real sense of lament and sometimes shame. They say, I started it. I just, and there's a lot of shaking of the head, and I couldn't finish it. And I say, that's no problem. That's extremely common. And I work this through with my students as well. Moby-Dick is a very hard book to read. And I know some of you out there have read it. We probably have some fans out there in the audience. But as I said, I bet we have people who tried and felt that they couldn't get through it. And it's very important to talk about that. First of all, let me say, it's not your fault. Also, there are no shoulds as far as I'm concerned, unless you're in my class and it's homework, in which case you should read it. But otherwise, there are no shoulds. So really what I want to stress is that we have this very interesting paradox with Moby-Dick. It's a book that most people have heard of, a lot of the hearing of it now comes through pop culture, but relatively few people have read it. And one of the effects of that situation is that there are grave misconceptions of what this book actually is like. And that's one of the reasons people hit the wall when they start reading it. So I thought I would just mention a few things that I have noticed over many years of talking to people about this book and teaching it. Some of the common problems that people run into, because if you have an aspiration to read Moby-Dick, if you've had difficulty in the past or you've never tried and you would like to, an aspiration I fully and enthusiastically support, it's very good if you start prepared, okay? So some misconceptions about the book. First of all, it doesn't have a plot. I mean, it sort of does, but the reason I phrase it that way is it's not a book about its plot. So one of the big misunderstandings is that this is an action adventure. And the sort of the soundbite that people know is Captain Ahab taking vengeance on Moby-Dick. And that's true, but very little of the book is that. There was a hilarious comment one of my students made in class one time. You know, Moby-Dick, the number of pages, of course, depends on the edition you have, but usually it's about 500 pages. And this happened to be a student who had read the book before, and he was a huge fan of Moby-Dick. And, you know, we were on like page 300 or something. And he said, well, at least in this chapter, they're finally doing something, which is actually a very good description because most of the book is nothing. Rob is laughing, note. Yeah. Most of the book. So one of the things I say to my students, because you have to get on this page, you have to enter into the actual life of the book, or you will shipwreck. You will shipwreck. You will be one of the people who gives up. You have to engage the book for what it is. So I say to them, it's like, an analogy would be, this is like the literary version of Seinfeld. It's a book about nothing. And when I say it's a book about nothing, I mean that in two ways, both of which are very accurate. First of all, it's not an action adventure story. If that's what you're expecting, you're going to be like, well, it's 300 pages and they're finally doing something. But it's also about a book about nothing in an existential sense. It's an extremely philosophical book, and people get frustrated with this if they're not expecting it. They keep waiting for things to happen. And mostly what happens is that Ishmael talks. And mostly he talks philosophy. Now there are ways, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about them more today. There are ways that you can help yourself to get on board with what it means to actually read that narrative, because it's not the action adventure you might have been hoping for. So once you unlock what it means to read this narrative voice, that's the greatness of the book. That's where it is. And the story of Ahab and the whale is only part of it. Now, at this point in our culture, I do believe that the vast majority of readers need someone to help them read Moby-Dick now. And again, maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this a little bit more later, but we are at a particular place in our culture right now in terms of what it means to read that is imperiling people's ability, through no fault of their own, to actually make it through Moby-Dick without some help. So you'll hear in my remarks today, I'm going to pull a lot of phrases and words out of Moby-Dick. Moby-Dick is about its sentences. And if you cannot pay attention to the sentences because you're rushing for action, you keep waiting for them to do something, you're going to wait many pages. I actually marked when I reread the book for our talk today that on page 438, you still have a character saying, "Where is Moby-Dick?" Because he hasn't shown up yet on page 438. So, okay, you get what I'm saying. This is a literary book. It's a book in which Melville is in love with ideas. He's in love with words. He's in love with language. And he's working out some very complicated emotions, propositions, and philosophical problems. and he works them out through interwoven threads across 500 pages. So you have to learn to read that. And because right now our culture is pushing all of us, myself included, into faster and faster habits of reading, into skimming. My undergraduates now mostly know how to skim, and they have a very difficult time actually reading closely. And we work on that every single day in class. And they recognize it's a problem they have. It's necessary for reading Moby-Dick. And that's why I'm saying, for those of you who are here today who haven't encountered the book yet or have had difficulty with it, I want to suggest those two kinds of adjustments, because you need a reading strategy in order to start connecting with what the life of the book actually is. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about this some more, and Rob and I will talk about it a little bit, but for now, I think Rob is going to make some introductory remarks as well.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was so great. You said that there should be no shoulds, but I think actually I'm going to impose a should upon people if only in a conditional mood. One of the questions that was asked of us ahead of time was quite delightfully, why is Moby-Dick considered one of the best American novels of all time? I think this is a great question, and I think a question of book lovers everywhere is why. What's so enjoyable about this thing? You know, what's the nature of the pleasure in this thing? Are there different varieties of pleasure to Moby-Dick? Where can they be located in this or that section of the book? What does this pleasure say about you, about your idiosyncratic history, about the cultures that produced you or the subcultures that produced the text? What lines of thinking does it offer for your ruminative pleasure? I think these are great, great questions. I think instead of, I think though I'd like to reframe the question a little bit in terms of greatness. And I would say, as a declaration, that Moby-Dick is a great novel, and by which I mean it has a great theme which it treats greatly well. I think you should like it if you have the luxury of giving it your time and your sympathy, which is a different matter. Famously, undergraduates don't have that time because, as Elizabeth remarks, they're always hastening to move forward with the plot, and they miss some of those fabulous sentences. The greatness of the novel, as I want to think about it, or I would ask you guys to think about it just this afternoon, is something we might think about under two headings. One, by way of the whale as a figure in the imagination of Ahab and Ishmael and the sympathetic reader. And the other heading would be under the figure of what we might call humanity overwhelmed. And here we can think of Ahab again and Ishmael again, though also Starbuck and the rest of the crew. And of course, once more, the sympathetic reader who reads along and in their sympathetic identification experiences many of these same or somewhat analogous things. These are the whale and humanity overwhelmed, sort of two figures for the same problem if approached from opposite directions. Namely, and the philosophical problem that Elizabeth was referring to, I think, is sort of a mismeasure between an ideal life, that is, how you think or imagine or fantasize life ought to be, and an actual life, together with the privation and the labor, the insecurity and the mortal finitude that goes along with that. It's not a problem that we face very comfortably, but it's a problem that I think we recognize and we feel its power. So the whale, to begin with, the whale as a figure in Ahab's imagination, the whale is quite explicitly given in the text as a symbol for Ahab, a symbol for life's insufferable exasperations, a symbol of the universe that is, indifferent or hostile to basic things that we feel like we're entitled to: freedom, dignity, a certain congeniality of circumstance. And we think these things are our birthright. And yet, actual life doesn't always run along those lines. And if you're the kind of person who thinks you might have a pretty nice life if only, or if only, then you know exactly what I'm talking about here. the question being for the novel, and maybe for you, for all of us, I was like, what do you make of these obstructions? What do you do with them? How do you imagine them? In the novel, Ahab, since this all sort of originates with Ahab's obsessions, we start with a very sort of local, specific complaint, namely the loss of his leg. But you can see how this very local problem metastasizes, so to speak, into a complaint about the frailty of the human body, a complaint perhaps about the ruined hopes of his young marriage and his recent paternity. And then it metastasizes still further into cosmic proportions, where the whale is not just a whale, not just a symbol of a ruined life, but really a symbol of the whole order of the universe that has permitted this ruination of Ahab's life, and consequently a symbol for the rest of the crew and for Ishmael and for the sympathetic reader. Finally, and there's lots of language in the novel that will support this, we get an image of the whale as a kind of version of God, but so specifically a kind of God that is, at best ungenerous or inattentive, but more typically in the novel, malicious or cruel. So the whale then, yes, is a symbol, and you can see how the whale is beautifully suited to carry this symbolic weight with its vague, formless body from the perspective of a conventional landsman. Its unthinkable mass and magnitude, its sublime power that's concentrated in this, just even in its tail. There's a fabulous section on the flukes and the power and the grace that's embodied there, and the illegible cipher of his aspect. And so in this figure of Moby-Dick, we get something of what we would also see in like Babylonian monuments or the Sphinx of the Pharaohs. We get this symbol of monstrous power, hinting towards the divine, but also carrying further significance for Ahab and for Ishmael and for the reader. Now, this is a deeply impious mission that Ahab announces and that the crew adopts, something that moves from complaint to rebellion. Any whaling ship is going to be doing battle with the elements, of course, but it's really only Ahab's Pequod that seeks to strike through these elemental masks and reach something transcendent beyond. It's a vengeance upon fate itself, an attempt to wrest back some dignity that has been withheld or stolen by God, and that we feel properly belongs to ourselves. I think I was thinking as I was rereading it these past few days, that it reminded me in certain respects of Wuthering Heights, where you have a similar kind of demonism and a similar kind of suspense between hope and doom. The second framing, what I called humanity overwhelmed, is like the flip side of this. And one way we might think about that is by way of what critical tradition and philosophy refers to as the sublime. The classic figures for the sublime are like the stormy sea, or the unscalable mountain, or the divinity and the power of the Sphinx, or perhaps the recourse that lovers will make to the stars and to the infinite heavens. Maybe even the Emersonian poetry of the immensities of time and space. But philosophers will also say that although the sublime seems to be a quality that would be attached to, for example, a whale, really, truly, it's a reflection on some aspect of ourselves and an aspect of our humanity. Really, truly, the sublime is a revelation of the puniness and the transitoriness of mortal being, of the poverty of our resources as compared to the mighty powers arrayed against us. So the event of the sublime is a sort of a thought of our own annihilation, except it's a thought of our own annihilation from a distance that allows for thought rather than for, let's say, pathological fascination or some kind of traumatic pathology. obviously, this is not our everyday attitude towards the world. Let's consider some of the lovely moments of our novel. I'm thinking here of Ishmael decamping from Manhattan, or that opening scene in which there are all these gazers migrating to the waters to look upon the sea. There's a great chapter about that sort of celebrates the naked Nantucketers that have conquered 2/3 of the terraqueous globe. There's an encomium on the divine and democratic dignity of man and the ideal. There's a beautiful, beautiful scene, one of my favorites in the novel, of Ishmael at the masthead, looking down into the waters, and he's mesmerized by this blending cadence of thoughts and of waves. There's a lovely, quite a moving scene near the end, a tender moment shared by Starbuck and Ahab when they speak of a longing for home and hearth. And yet, consider how all these lovely moments also have their shadows of something rather much darker. That is, Ishmael, decamping from Manhattan, is in the throes of the damp, drizzly November in his soul, and he goes to sea as an alternative to suicide. Really, he feels his life is cramped and his humors are out of balance. The dreamy attraction to the sea is shown everywhere to go hand in hand with a kind of disindividuation that, with Narcissus, looks like a drowning, and with Ishmael at the masthead still looks like a kind of a loss of his own individual powers. The tender moment, of course, between Ahab and Starbuck collapses as Ahab concedes his enslavement to his own obsessions, notwithstanding their likely fatal consequences. And the Nantucketers themselves are celebrated in that passage, not for their strength and not for their prowess, but really for their daring, which is to say, for living in proximity to death and living in proximity to a void on which they float for 3 hours at a stretch. 3 years at a stretch. So when I think about the greatness of the novel, I think of the greatness of the novel because it sort of asks us to do two things at one and the same moment, and to keep these in our minds at one and the same moment, namely the greatness of humanity, but at the same time, its precarity. And these things are not exactly opposed, but they coincide in our own conflicted souls. And we might say that the inconsistency of these things, their failure to cohere, is one of the defining features of human existence. So long as we leave them, as I think the novel does, sort of unresolved in their tension. And there are throughout the novel various avatars of this similar sort of tension between order and, for example, order and chaos, form and formlessness, being and nothingness, identity and disindividuation. Humanity as having been created in the image of God on the one hand, but also humanity as having been snatched by the hands of fate. Humanity is deserving of the fruits of the earth and loving comradeship on the one hand, but also humanity as subjected to the necessity of labor, a life of solitude, the dry salted fare that you eat on a ship. So what is one to make of this tension? You can complain, and maybe it's worth complaining about. You can rebel. Ahab rebels and dies. Ishmael rebels in his wake and survives, alone to tell the tale, as he says. So as we read Moby-Dick, we are sort of following along and sort of bearing witness to the fatal comeuppance of this hubristic fantasy of semi-divinity. So this is, as I think Emerson might say, a poetic truth of human life. Melville, writing about something similar in relation to Hawthorne, speaks of the blackness of darkness. And I think our opening pages of the novel suggest for Ishmael, but also for all these gazers who go to look upon the sea, it suggests that I think people wish for some kind of more intimate relationship to this unhappy fact, some more intimate relationship to the truth of this blackness of darkness. And I think Moby-Dick does us the very great service of putting us into contact with these things, and that's why it's a great novel. Thank you very much.
Elizabeth and Rob, thank you so much for your wonderful opening remarks. Now everyone will turn to the discussion. So if you have any comments or questions to add, please submit those using Q&A. So first we have a comment from Joy. She says, "That's me, started it, never finished it, and that's why I'm here." From Susan, we have a question. "It seemed to me like Moby-Dick is 3 books shuffled together. I wanted to take out scissors and sort them out, and I could not finish reading it. Please help me to understand the merit of combining so many compositional forms in one book."
Well, I can get us started on that. So if I understood correctly, our first 2 comments came from people who have started and not finished. Was that right? Okay,
Right.
so I want you to know you're not alone. And again, there are ways to tackle this problem, which is extremely common. But I'll first start with your explicit question. I'll make some remarks about it and then see if Rob also wants to address it. You felt like there were 3 books cobbled together, was the phrase, I believe, something like that. And I just want to say that you are completely in tune with the reviews that Moby-Dick got when it appeared. This was something that the reviewers noticed. And some of them liked it and some of them didn't. And they often in their reviews would describe what they thought the 3 different books were. So, they might say, well, it's part technical narrative about whaling. It's part tragedy in the story about Ahab, and it's part philosophical meditation or something like that. Those would be like 3 candidates for the 3 books. And remember, I mentioned that the reviews of Moby-Dick were mixed, very different from the reviews he got for his best-selling travel narratives. Those, and I'll mention it because it connects with Rob's points and takes us back to the issue of what Moby-Dick meant to Melville. His early books, which were loosely based in his experience at sea, people loved them. As I said earlier, they were wildly popular, but they got in huge trouble with the reviewers because Melville was writing about Polynesia and he was attacking the Christian missionaries for ruining Polynesia, for introducing disease, for failing to respect the indigenous people, for essentially turning them into, this goes back to a point of Rob's also, turning them into laborers for the whites who had arrived there ostensibly to improve the lives of the indigenous populations. And Melville was very critical of the Christian missions, and this was not something that would fly in Britain or the United States at this time. So that was the big critique he received for those early bestsellers. In Moby-Dick, there were moments when there was an American edition and a British edition. The British edition cut a lot of paragraphs and words and phrases that they felt were disrespectful to Christianity. The reviews took Melville to task also for that topic. It's a reminder of the hegemony of Christianity in the culture of publication at the time, the amount of trouble he got into for this topic specifically. But when the reviews talked about the form of the book, sometimes they felt, as our audience member did, they just felt it was kind of a hash and didn't really make sense. And other people said, well, I actually thought each of these parts of the book on its own was enjoyable. That was basically one way the reviews were mixed. And I believe the other part of the question, Rob, do you want to comment on this also about the form of the book?
Sure. Actually, I just have a brief comment, which is that there's this moment in the 1850s that is visible also in Richard Wagner, the German composer of operas, who at that time was composing his Ring cycle, his famous cycle of operas. And what Wagner is, one of Wagner's sort of key terms is the Gesamtkunstwerk, by which he means that he's trying, Wagner, like Melville in Moby-Dick, is trying perhaps to find a way in which there are all kinds of constituent art forms which can be maximized almost in a Fordist way to produce a maximal work of art. And it seems to me that this sort of baggy throwing everything in quality to Moby-Dick is a little bit is a little bit of that same moment of artistic experimentation in which Melville wants to throw in a treatise and throw in a history, throw in these moments of Shakespearean sort of comedy, as well as Shakespearean tragedy, plus the adventure novel. Like I think, and these explanations of all kinds of things about nautical life. I think he wants, maybe even in a bigger, more cosmic, more total way, to create a total work of art that takes advantage of the different resources of different varieties of writing.
Well, I thought I'd make one final comment on this before we go on, if that's okay, Clara, following up on Rob's points. Which is to say, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way the threads in this book tie together. It can feel like a very chaotic book before you have gotten to know it better. It is a book you do need to get to know it. And as I said, that's about the deep reading. This is a book, I said earlier, it's a book about nothing. That's my Seinfeld joke, but it's also a book about depth. It's about literal and figurative depth. And when Melville was reviewing, he wrote a review of Nathaniel Hawthorne while he was writing Moby-Dick. And some of his famous descriptions in that review, scholars have said Melville is writing a review of Hawthorne, but he's actually really talking about himself while he's writing Moby-Dick. So it's a great glimpse into Melville's mind while he is engaged in writing Moby-Dick. And one of the things he does is he distinguishes between what he calls thought divers and what he calls superficial skimmers of pages. And he judges those groups. He praises the thought divers who have been diving deep, and among them he numbers Hawthorne and Shakespeare, and it's clear he aligns himself with them. But he criticizes the superficial skimmers of pages. So that's partly what I mean when I say the book is about depth. I mean, at this point in Melville's life, he is falling in love with the idea of deep thinking. He had been kind of a journalistic travel writer prior to this. And he's just aflame with his, adoration for deep thinking at this point and deep writing. And, I love Rob's point too about Narcissus and looking into the water and what do you find there? And that's part of what we hear Melville talking about when he's writing that Hawthorne review. He also praises Hawthorne's Power of Blackness. This is like a Moby-Dick digression because I went on for so long, I forget where I started. So I apologize for that. We'll have to go on. Call me Ishmael.
Our next question from Ep. Which philosophical tradition is Moby-Dick close to, and have any later day philosophers become inspired by Moby-Dick?
Very broadly speaking, I would say he's working out of a tradition which is broadly Platonic or Neoplatonic, but also a philosophical tradition which in the late 1700s flourished in Germany, called idealism, and which sort of found its Concord, Massachusetts expression in transcendentalism with Emerson. I think there are lots. One of the things these things have in common is making a fundamental distinction between the world of appearance and a world of truth, which is distinct from that world of appearance. I think you can see that Melville has a similar kind of dichotomy between the world that you see and then some kind of mystical world. He used a word referenced by Elizabeth, the mystical world, which sort of undergirds this and is in some deep sense truer. Elizabeth?
Yes, and that's a great segue to, I want to connect with something you've been saying, which is Melville's connection to transcendentalism in the United States. And, you know, here I'm going to go back to my theme again, for those of you out there who are struggling to read this book. I feel your pain on that. It's one of the reasons I teach the class that I teach. I mean, there are different ways that I hope that I can suggest some strategies you might use to have more luck with it on another attempt. But, you know, some of you might know the comic writer Dave Barry, who said the problem with great books is that they're too long. And so he decided he would rewrite Moby-Dick in one sentence. And his one sentence is, don't mess with large whales because they symbolize nature and will kill you. Now, this is actually hilarious. I mean, it's a very good joke. And my connection here with Emerson is the way that Dave Barry uses the word nature. Now, you know, Emerson really kicks off transcendentalism, which is the American version, as Rob said, of idealism, of German idealism. And Emerson kicks it off in 1836 with an essay called Nature. So, unfortunately, the kind of bastardized version of Moby-Dick as a symbol of nature just seems really kind of wooden, and it's arbitrary and so on. But it's very helpful to understand what Emerson meant by nature, why he wrote an essay with that title, and then how Melville used it. So one of the opening paragraphs of Emerson's essay is talking about what is the relation between the self, which he defines as the soul. Now, that's a word all over Moby-Dick, the word soul. Very important word in Moby-Dick. And this is what Emerson's meditating on, the soul and what its relation is to the physical world. That's the question. What is the relationship? And he separates, incidentally, the self does not include your physical body in that essay. The self is your soul, and then there's the question of the material world. And what he's asking is, how are they related? And he ends a paragraph by saying, the whole sentence is, to what end is nature? Question mark. To what end is nature? Now, this is the question, a philosophical question that hovers over all of Moby-Dick. The question is, rephrased, what is the meaning of the material world? What's the meaning? I mean, that's why the word soul is all over Moby-Dick. It's also why Moby-Dick is constantly meditating on relationships between and among characters. So one of my favorite examples of this, and it makes the point very well, for those of you who have tried the book, if you've gotten this far, you'll recognize what I'm saying. Queequeg is the character who represents a character who does not have a self rooted in ego. Queequeg is the principle of human connection in this book. Students always love him. I love him. He's the principal. That's why he's tied to Ishmael with the monkey rope. They're literally tied together. And Ahab's out there all alone with his harpoon, as it were, right? He's the consummate individual. He's the consummate ego, and he dies for it. Queequeg dies too. He saves Ishmael's life. He saves people's lives repeatedly in the book. There's no ego to it. And the first time he saves someone in Ishmael's presence, when they're on a boat and there's a guy making fun of him, who then goes overboard, and Queequeg, unthinking, he dives over, he saves the guy. But Moby-Dick Ishmael often ends chapters in the final paragraph by turning to a metaphysical topic in some way. even chapters that are about nautical stuff. It's like, well, so let me tell you about all these knots or whatever it is. But at the end, there's often a philosophical reflection. That's a reading technique, by the way. For those of you who are struggling, I tell my students, watch for that. It's in a lot of chapters. But the chapter where Queequeg does that, his first dive to save someone, Ishmael poses the question, was there ever such unconsciousness? And he doesn't mean Queequeg is unconscious. He means he doesn't have this, what the romantics would call, Rob, right? This excess of self that's like a disease that separates him from nature, like the Cartesian mind-body problem. So that question of Emerson's, to what end is nature? What is the meaning of the material world? This is very important to Melville and Moby-Dick. But unlike Emerson, who for a long time, until later in his career, had a very optimistic answer to this question, Melville goes darker.
We have a couple of comments here about the greatness and the Americanness of the novel, so I'll read them all. First up from David. Rob, your discussion of tensions reminds me most acutely of the chapter on whale lines. And from the introductions, it seems like Moby-Dick is less the great American novel and more a great novel. When I hear the phrase great American novel, I think of a novel about the American condition, something like Kesey's Sometimes a Great Notion, which digs into the American paradox of individualism coexisting with collective action. Does Moby-Dick tackle something distinctly American? And then from Ron, I did my master's thesis on the illustration of Moby-Dick over the years since its publication. To prepare my own illustrated version of the book, I read Moby-Dick 3 times in a row. In my opinion, Moby-Dick defines the emerging American imagination. It gives America a unique literary voice. My question for both of you is, do you agree?
Okay, I actually have been puzzling on a question very close to that recently. Some of the preliminary questions were also asking about Moby-Dick as the quintessential American novel. And it's true that I personally see the novel less in American terms and more in sort of world literature terms. Partly that's my training and my formation, but I think you also have to say that the female half of humanity is entirely missing in this novel, or almost entirely missing. So, is it a portrait of America? Any kind of declarations for the Americanness of this novel are going to have to treat with a couple of facts. One is that the female half of America makes only scant appearance in this novel, and the other is just the general question. Like, it seems to me that when people make claims for Americanness, they're making an argument of some kind. Like, you have to know what Americanness is before you can declare whether Moby-Dick belongs to it in some superlative sense. So it's sort of a complicated undertaking. Elizabeth, do you have any wisdom to share on that?
Well, one of the things I like to do in these with these kinds of questions is figure out what the cultural history is of where the idea came from. Mm. And it just so happens in this case, somebody did the work for me, which is great. So there's a wonderful book that came out in 2014 by Lawrence Buell at Harvard called The Dream of the Great American Novel. And basically what he did was he took this concept, this phrase and its minor variants, and he just traced, when did people start using it? What were they talking about? What did they mean? So, it's a term that has a lot of baggage attached to it. And what Professor Buell shows is that the first time the phrase gets used is in 1868. And it's after the Civil War. And he explains why this becomes something that people start talking about. Among other fantastic work by Lawrence Buell, he wrote a very influential article some decades ago, pointing out that 19th century American literature was what he called a post-colonial phenomenon. that all over American culture, you had a massive cultural inferiority complex that was reinforced by how transatlantic cultures talked about the United States as a nation of bumpkins, essentially, uncivilized bumpkins. So there's this massive inferiority complex. And it means there's a tremendous amount of Anglophilia and an assumption that British art is better, an assumption on both sides of the Atlantic. British art is better, American art is inferior. And you get some very active vocal populations in the United States that try to fight this, Melville among them and Emerson among them. But after the Civil War, the nation of the United States is reconfiguring. Historians talk about this as the first time that the country changes from being basically a bunch of isolated hamlets into a nation that is connected by telegraph, by railroad, and so on. And so what Professor Buell says is you have a fresh engagement with the question of what does the nation of the United States mean? What is its power? How does it see itself? What's its self-image? And so he says people go back to this cultural inferiority issue, and they want to claim that there is a great American novel. It's a moment of nation building, essentially, in his analysis. So, that eventually, that term just gets applied to a lot of different books and authors for decades, because people get stuck on this as a kind of a hobby horse. So it makes sense when Melville is reclaimed, as I said, during the Melville Revival. And he was, remember I said he was attached with the Young America movement that was saying American artists can also be great. You see that in Moby-Dick in the chapters Knights and Squires, where he's using these British models, but he's saying, you know what? I'm not giving you British knights and squires. I'm giving you American whalers. So that there's so much baggage to that term that people start applying it anywhere they can make it stick. So in my view, my opinion is it's a meaningless term. I would get rid of it.
So Jerry says, I am 2/3 of the way through and will definitely finish because I'm not a quitter. I'm spending 30 minutes a day on it and not skimming, but I'm failing to see what caused people to look at this and think this is the best book in the English language. Thoughts?
I guess I would echo something that Elizabeth said at the start in her remarks, which is that actually you don't have to read Moby-Dick. The question for me is, or even sort of the Moby-Dickin sort of question is like, what is it? What kind of experience can arrange for you a more intimate relationship with the complicated, sometimes inconsistent, sometimes conflicted experience of your own existence? Does that make sense? And if that's reading Moby-Dick, or if that's going to Niagara Falls, or if that's reading some other book that you prefer, then from my perspective, it's all good. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying that if I understand correctly, this is your first time through the novel. And I would say, I didn't get the novel the first time I read it. I didn't feel the way then that I feel about it now. My opinion is that this is a novel that has to be reread. I think it is unusual to grasp its depths on the first read. And again, that's nobody's fault. Like I said, it's a book about depth. And the first time, there's only so much you can process cognitively about the book. I think you have to reread it. And in fact, boy, this is the moment where it's like, can I say what happens at the end? I guess I shouldn't. I do it with my students. I say, I'm telling you right now on the first day what happens at the end. All I will say tantalizingly is the book is a circle. So you have to reread it. Maybe that will help you get through the last third. Yeah, so my big message is I didn't care for the book really the first time I read it. It needs to be reread. So yeah, and you know, the thing is, like I said, there's only so much you can process mentally the first time. Remember what I said earlier about all the threads? There's a chapter called The Mat Maker where Ishmael and Queequeg are braiding this mat. And I often use that as a metaphor for the way the language of the book works, because threads do come and go constantly across the book. And threads of various kinds. There are key words that come and go all the time. There are key ideas that come and go all the time. Like I said, like human connections, right? The words, just an example, the words gloomy and jolly come up constantly. And they come up very specifically in particular chapters. Once you realize those are key words, you probably can't catch it on the first reading. Once you realize that they're key words, they are clues telling you you're supposed to put those chapters together. You're supposed to see how they're related. And then this takes us back into the depths of the self that Rob was talking about, because one of the main subjects of the book is the human experience of these poles of emotion. Joy, what's jolly, grief, and what's gloomy. This is a book with tremendous grief in it. I mean, the portrait in the symphony of Ahab, Rob, you were talking about that earlier, right? It's an incredibly moving chapter. There's a lot of grief in this book. But these are things, again, that there's too much there for you to get it the first time. So my advice would be start tracking those kinds of things that repeat. And when you go back the second time, you can start weaving the mat. That's what will help with what I said in my introductory remarks, to get you into the life of the book, which it is almost impossible to grasp on the first reading.
Jerry says, if I have to reread it, then it's a good thing I'm retired. So we're near the end of our time, but Rob and Elizabeth, would you like to share any closing thoughts about Moby-Dick with our audience?
I would, something that hasn't come up and which is a little bit, maybe is a little inappropriate for a forum like this, but I have to say, every time I read Melville, I just like swoon over the language. They're just great, great sentences, great alliteration, great inventiveness of, for example, he has this way of like taking a noun, turning it into a verb, turning it into an adverb. Like at one point, Ahab chases furiously, foamingly at his prey, or something like that. And the foamingly, that sort of transformation, this sort of packing into an adverb, into an just like it's really great. I'm just so amazed by what an inventive writer he can be. If this were a different kind of forum, I would ask everyone to read out their favorite sentences or something like that.
Yeah, the sentences are really beautiful. And I pulled something out here on my desk for show and tell. Maybe I'll use this as my final remark. It ties back to my point about how you can't like blow through the sentences fast because you want to get to the part where there's action, because pretty much nobody does anything ever, except for a few pages. So just don't expect that. But one of my other favorite chapters is called The Gilder. And one of the things that's happening in the Gilder is the Pequod is sailing through, it's approaching Japan, and they're the tropics, and it's beautiful. Rob, those chapters are great. I mean, the beauty of this, just this languorous tropical air. I mean, they're just beautiful, majestic writing. But I'm just going to read you one phrase, and then I'm going to explain, using this example, why you have to pay attention to the sentences. This is like not even a sentence. I'm reading you a clause. Okay, so the idea is the Pequod's sailing through the beautiful, beautiful, beautiful tropical water. It's absolutely spectacular. And you get this phrase about the surface of the ocean, right? That's the idea. I'm writing about the surface of the ocean. And you're like, when is somebody going to, kill Moby-Dick? No. This is what it's really about. The surface of the ocean. It's so beautiful. It's so beautiful, quote, one forgets the tiger heart that pants beneath it. Okay? Now, first of all, that idea is everywhere in this book with different words. The idea that you're sitting in your home by your fireside, comfortable, And then coronavirus comes rushing in. That kind of stuff happens constantly. So here it is again. This is what I mean by a pattern. Beautiful, beautiful ocean surface. One forgets the tiger heart that pants beneath it. And now for show and tell, I'm going to show you that clause became this book.
Awesome.
That clause from Moby-Dick is this book. That's where it came from. That's what I mean about the value of the sentences. And if you know this book, you now are going to recognize a whole bunch of the connections. But it came out of that idea. It's not just beautiful, beautiful writing, as Rob was saying, but that's a super important idea, and it's an existential idea. That's about human experience, if anything is in this book.
Well, a wonderful note to end on. Elizabeth and Rob, thank you so, so much for sharing your time and expertise. Virtual round of applause for you. All of the attendees, thank you so much for coming. I know we didn't get to all of your questions. You had some really great questions and comments. We appreciate it. I hope you'll be able to join us next month on January 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll be discussing A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. You'll receive more information about that and a recording of today's event in 7 to 10 days or so. Again, thank you all. Have a safe and healthy holiday. Have a good one. Thank you.